The 17th of January 1945, over the Ruhr Valley, Germany. The sky is torn in half by sound, not the familiar growl of piston engines or the staccato bark of cannon fire, but something else, something unfamiliar and deeply wrong, a shriek, a scream that rises above the winter wind like metal tearing through the fabric of reality itself. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann banks his Focke-Wulf 190 hard to starboard, his gloved hand trembling against the control stick, and in that frozen instant between one heartbeat and the next, he watches his wingman simply cease to exist. Not shot down, not spinning earthward in flames, erased. The FAV 190 disintegrates in a blinding flash of white-hot metal, its pieces scattering across 3,000 feet of frozen air like shrapnel from a dream. Hartmann's breath catches in his throat. His formation 12 aircraft strong just moments ago, fragments like glass struck by a hammer. And still that sound continues, rising and falling, a banshee wail that seems to chase them through the clouds. This is the winter of 1945, and the Luftwaffe is dying. Not slowly. Not with the dignity of soldiers who have fought well and lost honourably. The German Air Force is being torn apart in the skies over its own homeland by a weapon that defies every principle of aerial combat its pilots have learned. For 4 years, German fighter pilots have owned the European sky. They have perfected the art of aerial warfare through blood and mathematics deflection, shooting, energy fighting, the calculated dance of altitude and speed. They have faced British Spitfires and American Mustangs, learning to respect their opponents while believing in the ultimate superiority of German engineering and tactical doctrine. But now, in the war's final winter, something has arrived in the American arsenal that renders doctrine meaningless and experience worthless. The Americans call them high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs. The Germans, when they survive long enough to speak of them, have other names. Himmelsfeuer, Skyfire, Der Splittersturm, the fragmenting storm. These are not guided weapons. They cannot chase a target or correct their trajectory mid-flight. They are simply 5-inch tubes packed with 60 pounds of high explosive, mounted beneath the wings of American fighters and fired in salvos that turn the sky into an abattoir. The story of this weapon begins not in the desperate final months of the war, but 3 years earlier, in the research laboratories and proving grounds of the United States, where American engineers approached the problem of air combat with a characteristically American solution: overwhelming firepower delivered at industrial scale. The United States had entered the Second World War with aircraft armament that was, by most measures, adequate. Machine guns, cannon, eventually small bombs carried by fighters for ground attack. But adequate was never the American way of war. Adequate suggested limitation, constraint, an acceptance of parity with the enemy. The American industrial complex did not produce adequate weapons. It produced weapons of such excess, such overwhelming material superiority, that they redefined the psychological landscape of combat itself. The HVAR was born from this philosophy. Developed by the California Institute of Technology in cooperation with the Navy Bureau of Ordnance, it emerged from early rocket experiments conducted as far back as 1940, when the war was still someone else's problem and America watched from across an ocean. The first prototypes were crude, unstable, inaccurate, as likely to tumble uselessly through the air as to strike anywhere near their intended target. But American engineers possessed something their German counterparts increasingly lacked by 1943: time, resources, and the absolute certainty that every problem was ultimately solvable through sufficient application of industrial capacity. By 1944, the HVAR had matured into a weapon of terrifying efficiency, 5 inches in diameter, 64 inches long, 140 pounds of solid fuel rocket motor and high explosive warhead. Its maximum velocity exceeded 1,400 feet per second faster than most fighter aircraft of the era could dive. When fired, it left its launch rail with such force that pilots reported feeling their aircraft lurch sideways from the recoil. And unlike the small-caliber rockets that had come before, the HVAR carried enough explosive power to destroy a tank, obliterate a building, or as German pilots learned to their horror vaporize an aircraft in mid-flight. The rockets first appeared in the Pacific Theater, mounted on Navy Corsairs and Hellcats conducting ground attack missions against Japanese positions. There, they proved devastatingly effective against bunkers, supply depots, and surface vessels. But it was in the European theater, in the final year of the war, that the HVAR revealed its most psychologically destructive application. American fighter pilots flying P-47, Thunderbolts primarily, but also P-51 Mustangs modified to carry the weapons, began employing them not against ground targets but against German fighter formations. The effect was catastrophic, not merely in terms of aircraft destroyed, though those numbers mounted quickly enough, but in terms of what the weapon did to the fundamental logic of aerial combat. Oberleutnant Hartmann understood this logic. He had flown combat missions since 1942, survived 2 years of the Eastern Front, where every sortie was a mathematics problem written in fire and gravity. He knew how to judge closure rates, how to lead a target by precisely the right amount, how to conserve ammunition and strike only when success was certain. He knew that combat was a dialogue between two pilots, each attempting to impose his will upon the other through superior positioning, better tactics, greater nerve. The HVAR ended that dialogue. It did not engage in conversation. It simply announced, with a shriek of rocket motors igniting, that everything within 100-yard radius of its trajectory would cease to exist. And because American pilots fired them not singly, but in ripple salvos, 6 or 8 rockets releasing within seconds of each other, they created a kill zone that no amount of skill or experience could evade. German pilots called it Flächenvernichtung, area destruction. You could not dodge it the way you dodged bullets. You could not outturn it or outclimb it. When those rockets began their terrible flight, screaming toward your formation with trails of white smoke marking their passage, the only rational response was to break formation immediately, scatter in every direction, abandon every principle of tactical cohesion, and hope that you happened to flee in a direction the rockets were not traveling. And this, more than the physical destruction the weapons inflicted, was their true purpose. The HVAR was not designed to shoot down German fighters efficiently. Conventional gunfire did that well enough. It was designed to shatter German formations, to transform disciplined combat units into panicked individuals concerned only with survival, to strip away the very structure that made German fighter tactics effective. The Luftwaffe had always fought as a collective organism. The Schwarm, the 4-aircraft fighting unit, was the foundation of German tactical doctrine. 2 pairs of aircraft working in coordinated harmony, each pilot protecting his wingman's blind spots, attacking in sequence to overwhelm enemy defenses. This system had given German pilots a qualitative advantage, even as their quantitative inferiority grew more severe with each passing month. But the HVAR destroyed the Schwarm. When those rockets began to fly, when the sky filled with their inhuman screaming, and the air itself seemed to fragment into shrapnel, formations simply ceased to exist. Pilots broke left, right, up, down, each man making individual decisions driven by instinct rather than doctrine. And once scattered, they became prey. Lone German fighters, separated from their formations, were easy targets for the swarms of American Mustangs and Thunderbolts that seemed to multiply endlessly, as if the United States was manufacturing fighter aircraft faster than Germany could train pilots to oppose them, which in fact it was. The statistics tell a story of systematic destruction. In January 1945 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 300 fighters to all causes over the Western Front. February saw that number rise to 400. March exceeded 500. These were not merely aircraft, but pilots' men who represented years of training, thousands of hours of experience, irreplaceable expertise being erased from the sky at a rate that no amount of desperate recruitment could match. And increasingly, survivors' reports mentioned the rockets. Impossible to maintain formation under rocket fire. Unit cohesion collapses immediately. The psychological effect exceeds the physical danger. Pilots refuse to fly close formation when American fighters are reported in the area. One report, filed by a Gruppe commander in late February 1945, stated simply, The men no longer believe we can win the air battle. They have seen what the Americans can deploy. They know we have no answer. But the Germans had expected something different. This is crucial to understanding the weapon's psychological impact. German pilots, even in 1945, even as their airfields were being bombed daily and fuel supplies dwindled to critical levels, believed in certain fundamental truths. They believed in the superiority of German engineering. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, now beginning to appear in operational squadrons, could fly 50 miles per hour faster than any American piston-engine fighter. The Focke-Wulf 190 remained a superbly designed aircraft, capable in the right hands of defeating any opponent. German pilots believed in their training, which emphasized individual skill and tactical flexibility. They believed, or tried to believe, that quality could still triumph over quantity, that superior pilots flying superior aircraft could somehow offset the endless waves of Allied bombers and their fighter escorts. The HVAR mocked these beliefs. It was not elegant. It was not precise. It was not a weapon that rewarded skill or courage. It was simply a massive amount of explosive power hurled into the sky, with sufficient velocity to reach its target before that target could react. It represented everything the Luftwaffe had been taught to disdain about American military doctrine: crude, excessive, wasteful of resources, lacking in technical sophistication. And yet it worked. It worked with a terrible efficiency that reduced German tactical doctrine to irrelevance. A German pilot might be more skilled, might have a better aircraft, might execute perfect deflection shooting and position himself for the ideal attack, and then simply disappear in a flash of white light as an American rocket, fired from a mile away, exploded near his aircraft and sent shrapnel through his engine, his fuel tank, his body. There exists a recording, captured by an American signals intelligence unit, of German fighter pilots communicating during an engagement over Munich in March 1945. The audio is poor quality, crackling with static, but certain phrases emerge clearly. "Raketen! Raketen inbound!" The voice is young, strained to breaking. "Break formation, break now." And then silence. Not the silence of radio discipline, but the silence of transmission ended. A voice that will never speak again. Another voice, older. "Where is O-Gruppe? I cannot see O-Gruppe." And a third, barely audible. "Gone. They're all gone. We must leave this area immediately." The engagement lasted 7 minutes. German fighters destroyed. 11. American losses, 0. The Americans who flew these weapons understood, perhaps better than their commanders, what they were deploying. Lieutenant Colonel Robert S. Johnson, a Thunderbolt pilot who flew rocket-armed missions in early 1945, wrote in his personal log, "The rockets are terror weapons, pure and simple. They don't have to hit anything to be effective. The sound alone, that shriek when they light off, it's enough to scatter a formation even before the warheads detonate. We're not fighting pilots anymore. We're breaking their will to fight." This was not cruelty speaking, but simple observation. The American military had recognized a fundamental truth. In total war, psychological collapse is as valuable as physical destruction. An enemy who loses the will to resist is more thoroughly defeated than an enemy who fights to the last man. The HVAR was a tool of psychological warfare wrapped in the package of a tactical weapon. Consider what it meant to be a German pilot in those final months, waiting on a frozen airfield for the scramble order that would send you up to intercept yet another formation of American bombers. You have perhaps 50 hours of flight training if you are lucky. The veterans, the men with thousands of hours, are mostly dead now. You fly an aircraft that may or may not have a full fuel load, because fuel is scarce and the refineries are burning. You know, from briefings and from survivors' whispered conversations, that the Americans will outnumber you at least 5-1, possibly 10-1. You know that they fly in formations so large that they blot out the sun, and you know, with the certainty of nightmare logic, that somewhere in that formation are aircraft carrying the rockets. You will not see them launch. You will not have time to evade. You will simply be flying in formation one moment, and in the next moment the world will become light and sound and fragmentation, and if you are very lucky you will survive long enough to understand that you are falling, that your aircraft is gone, that you are alone in the sky, wearing a parachute that marks you as a target for every American fighter pilot who sees you. This was not the war they had imagined. In 1940, when the Luftwaffe ruled the skies over France and the Low Countries, when German fighter pilots accumulated victories at a rate that seemed to confirm every assertion of Aryan superiority the regime had made, they could not have conceived of this ending. They had been told they were the vanguard of a new order, warriors of a superior civilization confronting the decadent democracies of the West. They had been promised that German science, German discipline, German will would prove unstoppable, and for a time those promises seemed truthful. But now, in 1945, the truth revealed itself in the form of American rockets that shrieked through the sky like demons, scattering formations and breaking men who had once believed themselves invincible. The transformation was not merely tactical but existential. Surviving German pilots began to speak in different terms, not about victories or glory or service to the Reich, but about survival, about making it through one more mission, about seeing their families again, if their families still existed, if the cities where they lived had not been reduced to rubble by American and British bombers. The rockets became a symbol of something larger than themselves. They represented the sheer material abundance of American industry, the casual waste of resources that characterized the American way of war. Each rocket represented aluminum, steel, explosives, fuel resources Germany could no longer afford to expend on such single-use weapons. Each salvo of 6 rockets represented more explosive power than a German fighter pilot might use in his entire combat career. This was the reality the rockets communicated, that America could afford to hurl 60 pounds of high explosive at a single fighter aircraft and not consider it wasteful, that America possessed such overwhelming industrial capacity that it could manufacture these weapons by the tens of thousands and distribute them to fighter squadrons as casually as Germany distributed ammunition. The symbolic weight of this reality crushed German morale more effectively than the physical explosions. There exists a letter, written in April 1945 by a Luftwaffe pilot to his brother serving in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The letter was never delivered. It was found on the pilot's body after his aircraft was shot down over Hamburg. In it, he writes, "We are fighting a ghost, not men, but a machine that produces weapons faster than we can destroy them. They fill the sky with their aircraft as if they cost nothing, as if pilots grow on trees and fuel flows from the ground like water. And now they have rockets, Karl. They fire them like fireworks, dozens at a time, and each one could destroy a house. What are we supposed to do against this? How are we supposed to win when they can waste more resources on a single attack than we possess in an entire Group A?" This is the question that the HVAR posed to every German pilot who survived an encounter with it. How do you fight an enemy who can afford to waste? The German military, for all its tactical sophistication and operational excellence, was built on principles of efficiency and economy of force. Every bullet mattered, every shell, every gallon of fuel, every man was a precious resource to be deployed with maximum effect. The Americans appeared to operate under no such constraints. They could afford to fire 8 rockets to destroy 1 aircraft. They could afford to send 1,000 bombers escorted by 700 fighters on a single raid. They could afford losses that would have crippled any other nation's military and return the next day with seemingly undiminished strength. This was the abundance the rockets represented, not merely material abundance, but a philosophical abundance, a worldview that saw resources as essentially infinite and problems as solvable through the application of sufficient quantity. The sound of the rockets became a recurring element in survivors' accounts. Over and over, in different words, German pilots described that shriek, that rising and falling scream that announced the rocket's approach. Some compared it to a train whistle, others to a woman screaming. One pilot, in a medical report filed after he was grounded for combat fatigue, described it as the sound of God tearing paper. These descriptions suggest something beyond mere physical acoustics. The rocket's sound had become a symbol of inevitability, of inescapable fate. When you heard that sound, you knew that men were about to die. You knew that formations would scatter. You knew that the ordered world of tactical combat was about to dissolve into chaos and chance. The sound carried with it the message that all your training, all your skill, all your courage meant nothing against the sheer crushing weight of American industrial power. And yet some pilots adapted. Human beings are infinitely adaptable, even in circumstances that seem to render adaptation meaningless. By March 1945, certain German fighter units had developed tactics specifically designed to counter the rocket threat. They would approach American formations from high altitude, diving at maximum speed, attacking in loose formations rather than tight swarms, hoping that scattered aircraft would present less concentrated targets for the rockets. Some pilots learned to watch for the distinctive smoke trails that marked a rocket's launch and would immediately execute violent evasive maneuvers, barrel rolls, split-S dives, anything to displace their aircraft from its predicted position. These tactics achieved limited success. They kept some men alive who might otherwise have died. But they could not solve the fundamental problem. There were too many American aircraft, and they all carried too many rockets, and Germany had too few pilots, and too little fuel, and too little time remaining. The final irony is that the HVAR, for all its psychological impact, was not actually the most effective aerial weapon the Americans possessed. In purely statistical terms, conventional gunfire destroyed far more German aircraft than rockets did. The .50 caliber machine gun, that quintessentially American weapon, mounted in batteries of 6 or 8 on P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds, accounted for the vast majority of Luftwaffe losses in the war's final year. But statistics miss the point. The rockets were never primarily about kill ratios or efficiency metrics. They were about projecting power, about demonstrating absolute material superiority, about communicating to the enemy that resistance was not merely futile but absurd. When an American pilot fired a salvo of rockets at a German formation, he was not simply trying to shoot down aircraft. He was delivering a message. We have so many resources that we can afford to use these massive, expensive weapons against individual targets. We are not constrained by scarcity. We are not fighting to survive. We are here to impose our will, and we will use whatever force is necessary to do so. This message was not lost on German pilots or their commanders. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early 1945 show an obsessive focus on the rocket threat, attempting to calculate how many were being produced, how widely they were being distributed, whether their supply was truly unlimited or whether the Americans might run short. The reports reveal a desperate hope that this was all temporary, that the rocket barrage would slacken, that Germany might somehow find a way to counter this weapon. But the barrage never slackened. If anything, it intensified. By April 1945, nearly every American fighter aircraft operating over Germany carried rockets as standard armament. The sky had become a place of perpetual danger, where death could arrive not with the warning of engine noise or the traces of machine gun fire, but with a shriek and a flash, and then nothing. There is a photograph, taken by an American reconnaissance aircraft in April 1945, that captures something of this reality. It shows a German airfield, one of the last still operational in the Reich, with perhaps 20 fighters parked along the field's edge. They are not dispersed in protected revetments, but simply lined up, wing to wing, as if on display. Luftwaffe pilots who saw this photograph after the war noted immediately what it meant. Fuel was so scarce that these aircraft could not afford to taxi individually to their takeoff positions. They would be towed into position by oxen or by hand, and only then would their engines be started for the immediate scramble. This was what the war had become for Germany oxen-towing fighter aircraft, because Germany no longer had enough fuel for engines, while American pilots flew overhead with wings laden with rockets that used more fuel in their 3-second burn than a German fighter could afford for an entire mission. The epilogue to this story is written in silence. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its surviving aircraft were grounded for lack of fuel. Its surviving pilots were scattered, many having walked away from their bases as Allied forces approached, choosing surrender or simply disappearing into the chaos of the Reich's collapse. The rockets had played their role in this ending, not the decisive role, not the only factor, but a significant one. They had accelerated the psychological collapse of German air power by demonstrating, every time they flew, the impossibility of German victory. They had forced German pilots to confront the reality that they were not fighting other pilots, but an entire industrial civilization, one that could produce weapons of such excess that it could afford to waste them. In the decades after the war, when historians and military analysts studied the HVAR, they tended to focus on its technical specifications, its accuracy rates, its kill per mission statistics. These analyses missed what German pilots understood viscerally, that the weapon's true power was not in what it destroyed, but in what it represented. It represented the American philosophy of war that problems could be solved through the application of overwhelming force, that industrial capacity could be transformed into tactical dominance, that quantity possessed its own form of quality when deployed at sufficient scale. For German pilots, raised in a military tradition that emphasized elegance, efficiency, and the triumph of superior will over material circumstances, this philosophy was incomprehensible and unstoppable. They could not defeat it because they could not even properly engage with it. You cannot outskill abundance. You cannot outwill industrial production. You can only endure it until you break, or until it finally, mercifully, ends. The rocket's shriek faded from the European sky in May 1945, but its echo persisted in the memory of every German pilot who heard it and survived. That sound became a symbol of a particular kind of defeat, not the defeat of being outfought by a superior opponent, which carries its own dignity, but the defeat of being overwhelmed by sheer material force, of having your skill and courage rendered irrelevant by an enemy who possesses such abundance that they can afford to waste resources destroying you. It is the defeat that comes from realizing that the war was never between pilots, between men, between competing ideologies of combat. It was between industrial systems, and yours was smaller, weaker, already dying long before you ever climbed into the cockpit. And so the sky over Germany in that final winter became a teaching ground, though the lesson came too late for any practical purpose. What it taught was this, that freedom and democracy, for all their apparent softness and indiscipline, possessed a hidden strength that totalitarianism could never match. They could produce abundance. They could mobilize entire populations not through terror but through belief. They could manufacture weapons at scales that seemed impossible to societies built on extraction and subjugation. The rocket, shrieking through the frozen air, was more than a weapon. It was a message written in fire and explosion, and the shattered remains of formations that would never reform. The message read, "We have more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more weapons, more of everything. We can afford to waste. You cannot. This war is over. You simply haven't admitted it yet." Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann landed his damaged Focke-Wulf at a field in Bavaria on the evening of the 17th of January 1945. He had survived the encounter that killed his wingman and scattered his formation. He would fly 17 more missions before the war ended, each one a repetition of the same nightmare. Outnumbered, out-resourced, hearing that terrible shriek in his memory even when no rockets were actually present. In his memoirs, written decades later, he devoted only 2 sentences to the rockets themselves. They made a sound I will never forget. They taught us that we had already lost. In those 2 sentences lies the entire truth of what the HVAR accomplished. It destroyed aircraft and killed pilots, yes. But more than that, it destroyed belief. The belief that skill mattered, that courage mattered, that anything mattered except the cold mathematics of industrial production. And when that belief died, scattered across a winter sky in fragments of burning metal, the war died with it. All that remained was the waiting, and the shriek of rockets reminding German pilots daily that the waiting would not last much longer, that the end was coming on wings laden with weapons that represented everything their ideology had denied, that democracy could fight, that freedom could kill, and that abundance, that most American of virtues, was the ultimate weapon in a total war.